Really good, very warm. It's always good fun to walk onto a brass band. But you know, I think ultimately actually it was quite a positive korero and positive vibe overall, I thought. I thought the Prime Minister had a few flat points in his speech, but otherwise pretty good overall.
So what did you make of his speech? What do you mean by flat points?
Well, I'm not sure he picked his audience particularly well. You know, I don't think he was actually speaking to the issues of concern that were being raised. And I think his just dismissal of it as an overreaction or just nothing to get worried about, I think was actually pretty patronising.
What were the issues of concern?
Well, the Treaty Principles Bill was clearly you know, front and centre, given that actually a number of MPs are not here today because they're currently hearing submissions on the Treaty Principles Bill. So it's still a live bill. Whatever you know, Christopher Luxon and Winston Peters say, right now Parliament is still considering that bill. And so, you know, that was clearly a concern. But I think the sense that a lot of progress around issues affecting Māori is being dialed back is also a pretty strong undertone from many of the comments today. So things like, you know, rolling back Te Whakawhai order, for example, just to name one, those are things that continue to cause concern.
We also heard that you know, relations between Māori and the government are the worst they've been in quite a while. What did you make of those comments?
I don't think most New Zealanders will be surprised by that. This government seemed to be going out of its way to worsen the relationship between Māori and the government. And frankly, I think, you know, responsible governments try and do the opposite. They try and bring people together.
What's in it for them to do that?
Well, you know, certainly David Seymour, New Zealand First, they've got long histories of trying to divide the country in order to get a few votes. Unfortunately, Christopher Luxon seems to be going along with that.
Given the concern around the Treaty Principles Bill, what do you make of the absence of David Seymour today?
Oh, I mean, I think David Seymour, you know, if he had the courage of his convictions and was genuinely wanting a debate, he'd show up and have the debate. He's not willing to do that because in his view, an open debate is one in which only he gets to speak and everybody else has to listen.
And David Seymour has been delivering a State of the Nation address today, and he raised the topic of privatisation and said it's something that New Zealand should be more open to discussing. What do you make of that sort of talk, and does that concern you? Well,
I'm not surprised. I mean, that is ultimately this government's agenda. It's the most right-wing neoliberal government that we've seen since the early 1990s. You know, they want to defund, destabilise and privatise as much of the public service as they possibly can. And that includes things like healthcare, things like education and so on. And I actually don't think that's an agenda most New Zealanders support.
There was a lot of talk about collaboration though and sort of working together. Both of the governing parties here said that they are voting down the bill, and sort of that's non-negotiable. I mean, is it really helpful to keep that conversation going? Like, what does it achieve?
Well, ultimately, I think you should judge governments by their actions rather than by their words. You know, this government's words and actions don't match up. Right now, today, as we stand here, Parliament select committees are meeting to consider the bill that Christopher Luxon says he doesn't support.
But to also hear people's thoughts on it, which you know does seem to be like an overwhelming amount. Like, is that not important?
I think this is the wrong way to have this debate. If you want to have a genuine debate about where this treaty sits within our constitutional arrangements in the future, this is not the way to start it.
Do you think Kiwis trust Christopher Luxon that the bill is going to be voted down?
Well, David Seymour clearly doesn't, because he continues to go around the country saying he's confident that the bill's going to continue and that the bill may even pass. That means that he's basically calling the Prime Minister a liar. Every time he says that, every time he says, no, this bill might well pass, he's saying Christopher Luxon is a liar. That's Christopher Luxon's future Deputy Prime Minister saying that.
Just on that, the Prime Minister has said ad nauseum that the bill won't make it beyond to second reading. And then today we heard from both Winston Peters and Shane Jones really strong language, like completely snuffing out the possibility of it going any further than what's in the coalition agreement. Do you think that'll ease people's concerns? People are still obviously very worried and concerned about it, but hearing from both Winston and Shane may assuage some of those concerns?
Well, they've been saying that for months, so the bill is still live. It's still before the Select Committee right now, and if David Seymour doesn't believe them, David Seymour, the future Deputy Prime Minister, doesn't believe them, why should New Zealanders?
Well, they've come here to Rātana, and that's been one of their key points of their message, is to front people to hear their concerns, one of them being about the bill, and to say, and to reassure people that it won't go any further. The Prime Minister's not sort of managed to do that yet, because the public clearly don't sort of, portion of the public that don't think that the can't take him at his word on that.
Well, if David Seymour's not taking him at his word, then I think New Zealanders have a right to be suspicious. But even when this bill does get voted down, if they follow through and if they honour the commitments that they've now made, the damage has been done. They've set the relationship between Māori and non-Māori back by decades, and it was an unnecessary debate. We didn't need to do this. Christopher Luxon, if he'd had some backbone, should have just said to David Seymour, no, we're not going to do it.
On Act's goal of privatisation, do you think he would have any chance of achieving that with the current coalition?
Well, he already is. So if you look at some of the areas, charter schools is a good example, where there's a very clear privatisation agenda underway there. Even in issues such as roading, the current government are actively talking about greater private investment, privatisation, and I think we're likely to see a lot more of that out of this government.
But what about healthcare? Do you think that could run better if it was more privately operated?
Well, ultimately, you get what, out of the health system, you get what you pay for. And the population has grown significantly. And, one of the biggest financial pressures on the health system is actually from a changing demographic. It's more older New Zealanders, more younger New Zealanders, and a bigger population overall. If we want our health system to keep up with that, then we've got to fund it for that.
Given the cost, though, is there a greater need, or does David Seymour have a point that a privately run or more privately run health system could deliver better results?
There's no evidence of that. I mean, it's just pure ideology on his part that the private sector is better at everything. Actually, New Zealand's own experience of privatisation suggests otherwise. How'd that work out with the railways? They basically privatised the railways, they got run into the ground, and we're still picking up the pieces from that. There are countless other examples of where privatisation has failed. Bill English told New Zealand that by privatising the electricity companies, we were going to get lower power prices. How's that worked out?
On the damage, you said that's already done from the Treaty Principles Bill. If you were to get a next government, how would you repair that?
I think we've got to focus on the things that bring the country together. The treaty should be a source of unity. It should be a source of, we should reflect on the treaty and the visionary leadership shown in the signing of the treaty all those years ago with a great degree of pride as New Zealanders. It is our founding document. I think this government talk it down all of the time. Bearing in mind that regardless of what Christopher Luxon and Winston Peters say about the Treaty Principles Bill, they have another bill that is currently being drafted that's going to remove the treaty from large swathes of other government legislation. So there is a very anti-treaty agenda continuing to be pursued by this government.
So Labor would undo those sort of policies should they get through? I mean, would it reinsert Te Reo into the public service? Would you go as far just to reverse all the things that the government did?
We'll set out our position as those issues arise. But we haven't seen the detail of the bills. They're currently being prepared, but we don't like the direction that they're heading in.
It's clear from Shane Jones and the Prime Minister that they're pretty fatigued talking about the Treaty Principles Bill. They didn't really seem to want to get into that conversation much. But do you see much point in litigating it here, given, like has been mentioned, they've said ad nauseum that it's not going anywhere, all this kind of stuff. But do you see much point litigating it there?
Well, I think when you visit someone to listen to them, you have to listen to what they're saying. They wanted to raise this. It's an issue that's very important, and I think that if you're coming to listen, then you should do that.
And David Seymour, it sounds like, has been having conversations with Chris Bishop around state house sell-offs. What do you make of that?
This is typical National Party. They are very comfortable selling off state houses. They're not comfortable building them. If we actually want to end homelessness in this country, booting people out of motels onto the street is not the way of doing it. Building more state houses has got to be part of the answer. We were building more state houses than any government since the 1970s. We had a really comprehensive build program underway, and it's grinding to a halt under this government because they're basically pulling funding out of it. We don't need fewer state houses, we need more of them.
On housing, those people who have emergency housing places and motels are on the streets?
Well, how would we know exactly where they've gone? Because as Tama Potaka himself has said, they haven't tracked where people have ended up. And they can only tell you that where a fraction of them have ended up in terms of additional housing placements. So a significant number of them were put into emergency accommodation because they were living on the street. If they've simply been sent out of emergency accommodation with nowhere else to go, many of them will have ended up back on the street again.
How does he fix that problem? I mean, you can understand why some people wouldn't want to give that private information to the state.
Build more rental houses. Build more state houses.
Do you think this is something to celebrate? The government says it has achieved its target of reducing the number of people in emergency housing?
Look, emergency housing isn't something that any of us should aspire to, but I would rather have kids living in emergency housing than living in the back of a car or in a garage. So yes, it's supposed to be what it says on the tin. It's emergency accommodation. But the way of getting people out of emergency accommodation isn't just to boot them out on the street. It's to make sure you're building more state houses, getting more affordable rentals into that market, so that they're not living in motels.
Is there any evidence either way to say that they have booted people onto the street?
Certainly we're getting a lot of anecdotal feedback from people about the fact that were in emergency accommodation, now they have nowhere to live.
Nicola Willis had a little bit of a jab this morning about Labour's lack of policies. How do you balance that with what you were saying yesterday about wanting to develop those policies? I mean, offering an alternative is what you mean.
Oh, look, coming from Nicola Willis, the woman who has driven the New Zealand economy into the deepest recession since 1991, I would have thought that she'd have bigger things to be worrying about than our policy development process.
One of the things that was raised by speakers today was also the changes to the Waitangi tribunal. What's your response to that?
I am concerned about the overall direction of travel of the Waitangi tribunal. That's not to say I'm opposed to all of the new people who have been appointed, but they've lost a lot of really valuable experience from the people that they have removed, some of whom were actually relatively recent appointments. This is the most political purging of the Waitangi tribunal that we've seen in a generation.
What do you think will be the impact?
Well, it'll have a huge impact. I mean, ultimately it potentially neuters a voice that's been very important for Māori. Okay, thanks everyone. Cheers.